In 1968, a reporter named Bill Baldini brought a camera crew into a state institution in southeastern Pennsylvania called the Pennhurst State School and Hospital. What he filmed there, over the course of 5 visits, was broadcast on Philadelphia's Channel 10 in a series titled Suffer the Little Children. Millions of people watched it. Most had never heard of Pennhurst. Most had never thought about what happened inside the hundreds of state-run institutions that housed Americans with intellectual and developmental disabilities across the country. And most had never considered a question that the documentary made impossible to avoid. What were the people inside those buildings being given to eat? One detail from the documentary lodged in the public consciousness more firmly than almost any other. The average zoo in the United States, Baldini's investigation revealed, spent $7.15 per animal per day on food and care. Pennhurst spent $5.90 per resident per day on everything: food, clothing, medical care, staffing, maintenance, heating, electricity. Everything it cost to house a human being for 24 hours came to less than what a city zoo budgeted for a single animal. The residents of Pennhurst were not animals, but the meal they were served that evening, and every evening, reflected exactly what $5.90 could buy when it had to cover a human life. And Pennhurst was not an outlier. It was a sample, one institution among hundreds, all governed by the same arithmetic, all feeding the same kind of meals to the same kind of people, all operating behind walls that the public never saw and the press rarely entered. This is not a story about deliberate cruelty. It is a story about arithmetic, about what happens when a government takes custody of the most vulnerable people in its care and then fails to fund the basic obligation that custody creates. And the most basic of those obligations, the one that no institution can avoid and no budget can entirely conceal, is food. The system that housed Americans with disabilities in large, isolated institutions did not begin as neglect. It began as reform, one of the most well-intentioned reform movements of the 19th century. In the 1840s, advocates like Dorothea Dix traveled across the United States, documenting the conditions in which people with mental illness and intellectual disabilities were kept, in jails, in poorhouses, in private homes where they were hidden from view. Dix argued that the state had a moral obligation to provide care, and her advocacy led to the construction of dozens of state-funded institutions in the second half of the century. The intention was genuine. These were meant to be places of shelter and improvement, with farms, kitchens, and workshops where residents could live with dignity. Pennhurst was one of these institutions. Authorized by the Pennsylvania legislature in 1903 and opened in 1908 as the Eastern Pennsylvania State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic, a name that reflected the language and the assumptions of the era, it was designed as a self-sufficient campus. The buildings were spread across more than 100 acres of land in Spring City, Pennsylvania. There was a power plant, a railroad spur, a dairy farm, a laundry, a bakery, and a kitchen capable of preparing meals for the entire population. Food was grown and prepared on site. Residents who were able to work were assigned to the farm, the kitchen, the laundry, and the workshops as part of what the administration called occupational therapy. The campus was designed to operate without any interaction with the surrounding community. And that, as it turned out, was part of the problem. If you've been watching this channel, you know that the moment a system is asked to do more than it was built for is the moment it begins to fail. Subscribe if you haven't, because this story follows the same arc as every episode on this channel. A system under pressure, a failure that nobody sees, and the people who finally force the country to look. Here's a question for the comments. Have you ever thought about who decides what the most vulnerable people in a country are given to eat? The pressure came from above, from state legislatures that kept sending people to institutions without increasing the funding to care for them. Through the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, the population of Pennhurst grew steadily. The legislature had classified an ever-widening range of conditions as grounds for institutionalization. People with severe intellectual disabilities were sent. People with epilepsy were sent. People who were deaf or blind were sent. Orphans were sent. Immigrants who spoke no English and could not navigate the systems available to them were sent. Adolescents classified as delinquent, many of whom had no disability at all, were sent because the state's correctional facilities were overcrowded and Pennhurst had beds. The institution had been designed to serve a specific population. The state used it to warehouse anyone it did not want in the community. In 1913, the Pennsylvania legislature's Commission for the Care of the Feeble-Minded declared that people with disabilities were unfit for citizenship and posed a menace to the peace. Language rooted in the eugenics movement that influenced American policy throughout the first half of the 20th century. The eugenics movement which argued that human society could be improved by controlling reproduction, and that people with disabilities, mental illness, or other conditions deemed defective should be prevented from having children, provided the intellectual justification for institutional confinement on a massive scale. The goal was no longer to improve the lives of the residents. The goal was to keep them away from everyone else, and, in some states, to prevent them from reproducing. The institutions became, in practice, permanent warehouses. People were admitted as children and remained for the rest of their lives. The average age of residents at Pennhurst in 1974 was 36 years old. Most had been there for more than 21 years. They had entered as children during an era when families were told, by doctors, by social workers, by the state itself, that institutional care was the best option, that their children would receive education and treatment, that the institution would provide what the family could not. Many parents visited regularly at first, then less frequently, then not at all, discouraged by distance, by the institutional rules that controlled when and where visits could occur, and by the gradual, terrible realization that the place they had entrusted with their child's life was not what they had been promised. The numbers climbed. By the mid-1950s, Pennhurst's population had reached nearly 3,500, almost 900 more than capacity. The staff-to-resident ratio declined steadily. For much of the institution's history, residents classified as higher functioning had provided unpaid labor, working the farm, cooking the food, cleaning the wards, that kept the institution running. But in the late 50s and 60s, as states developed specialized facilities for juvenile offenders and diverted them away from institutions like Pennhurst, the institution lost a significant portion of its unpaid workforce. The buildings grew more crowded, the staff grew fewer, the budget stayed flat, and the meals that reached the residents reflected the mathematics of a system that was collapsing from the inside. The farm still operated, the kitchen still cooked, but the meals that reached the residents reflected the mathematics of a system that had too many people and not enough money to feed them. The food budget at Pennhurst was not a separate line item in the institution's accounting. It was absorbed into the total per-resident cost, the $5.90 that covered everything. When the legislature set the funding level, it did not specify how much should go to food, how much to staffing, how much to medical care. The administration allocated the money as best it could, and when the total was not enough, when $5.90 had to stretch across 24 hours of a human being's life, the food was among the first things to suffer. Not because the kitchen staff were indifferent, because the money was not there. Meals were prepared in bulk. They were served on trays in ward dining rooms where dozens of residents ate simultaneously, under the supervision of whatever attendants were available, sometimes 2 or 3 staff members for a ward of 70 people. Residents who could not feed themselves independently were, in many documented cases, not adequately assisted. Not because the attendants did not care, but because a single staff member could not physically feed 7 or 8 people at the same time. Some residents lost weight, some developed conditions consistent with nutritional deficiency. The documented record, assembled through lawsuits, investigations, and the testimony of former staff, describes meals that were consistent with institutional economy, not with what a human being needed to remain healthy. Malnutrition was not an anomaly. It was a finding. Court documents from the Halderman versus Pennhurst lawsuit, filed in 1974, included evidence that residents suffered from conditions associated with chronic nutritional inadequacy. The court did not use the word starvation. It did not need to. The evidence spoke for itself. In an institution operated and funded by the state of Pennsylvania, the people in the state's care were not being adequately fed, and Pennhurst was not unique. It was representative. Across the country, in the 1950s and 60s, state institutions for people with disabilities were experiencing the same pressures: rising admissions, static or declining budgets, deteriorating physical plants, and staffing levels that made adequate care mathematically impossible. The meals served in those institutions reflected the same arithmetic: what could be provided for the money available, not what the residents required. The first national exposure of these conditions came from a politician. In 1965, Senator Robert F. Kennedy conducted an unannounced visit to the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, New York, an institution for people with intellectual disabilities that had been built to house 4,000 residents and now held more than 6,000. Kennedy's description of what he found was quoted in newspapers across the country. He compared the institution to a snake pit and described residents living in filth and dirt, their clothing in rags, in rooms less comfortable and cheerful than the cages in which we put animals in a zoo. The visit produced headlines. It did not produce reform. New York State issued a 5-year improvement plan. Conditions continued to deteriorate. Admissions continued. Budgets did not increase. And the gap between what the institution promised and what it delivered grew wider with every passing year. If you're still here, hit subscribe, because the people who finally broke the silence were not politicians. They were a doctor, a a reporter, and a lawyer, and the evidence they assembled changed the legal rights of every person with a disability in the United States. Here's a question. Who should be responsible for making sure the most vulnerable people in a country are properly fed? And what happens when they fail? 7 years after Kennedy's visit in 1972, a 29-year-old reporter named Geraldo Rivera was contacted by Dr. Michael Wilkins, a physician at Willowbrook who had been dismissed for speaking out about conditions at the facility. Wilkins gave Rivera a key. Rivera brought a camera crew inside without notifying the administration, an unannounced visit that captured the conditions as they existed without preparation or concealment. The footage was broadcast on WABC TV as Willowbrook, the Last Great Disgrace. Rivera later recalled that the doctor had warned him it would be difficult to witness. The reality exceeded the warning. Rivera described the smell as unlike anything he had encountered. The smell, he said, of filth, of disease, and of something worse than either. The film showed overcrowding on a scale that made individual care impossible. It showed staffing so inadequate that entire wards were left unsupervised, and the subsequent lawsuit would formally document what the broadcast had shown the country. The residents of Willowbrook were receiving inadequate meals, inadequate clothing, and inadequate medical care. Dr. Wilkins provided one additional piece of information that illustrated the conditions at Willowbrook in terms no viewer could misunderstand. 100% of residents at the institution contracted hepatitis within 6 months of admission. Every person who entered Willowbrook became infected, not because of a single contamination event, but because the overcrowding, the sanitary conditions, and the inadequacy of the food preparation and water systems had created an environment in which a communicable disease could spread through the entire population with absolute efficiency. The institution's leadership had known this for years. In fact, researchers affiliated with the institution had conducted experiments that deliberately exposed incoming residents to the hepatitis virus, on the grounds that they would contract it anyway. Experiments that were later cited as among the most egregious violations of medical ethics in American history. The meals served in that environment, prepared in kitchens operating under the same impossible budget constraints as Pennhurst, served in dining rooms operating under the same staffing shortages, consumed in wards where communicable disease was endemic, were part of a system that had failed at every level simultaneously. The food was not a separate problem. It was the same problem as the overcrowding, the understaffing, the disease, and the indifference, experienced 3 times a day, at every meal, by every resident, for as long as they remained inside. The lawsuits that followed came from both directions, and together they reshaped the legal landscape of institutional care in America. At Willowbrook, a class action lawsuit was filed in March 1972, weeks after Rivera's broadcast. The plaintiffs alleged that the institution violated the constitutional rights of its residents, including the right to adequate food. The case was settled in April 1975 with the Willowbrook consent judgment, in which New York State agreed to reduce the institution's population, improve conditions, and develop community-based alternatives for residents who could be served outside the institution. At Pennhurst, attorney David Furliger filed suit in 1974 on behalf of resident Terry Lee Halderman. The complaint documented the conditions that Baldini's documentary had shown the public 6 years earlier, conditions that, the evidence would demonstrate, had not improved. The trial produced testimony from staff, from physicians, and from experts in nutrition, psychology, and institutional care. The court's findings were detailed, specific, and, critically, undisputed by the defense. The food was inadequate. The staffing was inadequate. The conditions violated the residents' constitutional rights. In 1977, Judge Raymond Broderick issued a ruling that would echo through 3 decades of disability law. The residents of Pennhurst had a constitutional right to be cared for in the least restrictive environment, appropriate to their needs. The ruling did not merely order Pennhurst to improve its food or hire more staff. It ordered the state to move its residents out of the institution entirely into smaller, community-based settings where their needs, including the need to be properly fed, could actually be met. The institution, the court concluded, was not capable of providing adequate care. The model itself had failed. The ruling was immediately challenged. The state appealed. The case reached the Supreme Court twice. But the evidence Judge Broderick had entered into the record, the testimony about the food, the staffing, the malnutrition, was never disputed. No one argued that the residents were being adequately fed. The defense argued only that the court lacked the authority to order the state to close the institution. It did not argue that the institution was working. While the appeals proceeded, deinstitutionalization began, not just at Pennhurst, but across the country. The transition took years. In many states, it took decades. Some families resisted, parents who had placed their children in institutions and feared the alternatives would be worse. Some communities resisted, neighborhoods that did not want group homes on their streets. Some legislatures resisted, balking at the cost of building a community-based system, even as the cost of maintaining crumbling institutions continued to rise. But the transition happened, and one of its most visible effects was on the food. The group home that replaced the institution was, by design, the opposite of Pennhurst. Where Pennhurst housed thousands, a group home housed 6 or 8 or 12. Where Pennhurst had a single institutional kitchen preparing bulk meals for an entire campus, a group home had a kitchen the size of a family's, designed for meals planned around individual needs and preferences. Where Pennhurst's food budget was buried inside a per-resident number that covered every other expense, a group home's food budget was a visible, auditable line item, subject to licensing standards that specified what constituted an adequate meal. The staffing ratios changed. In a group home with 8 residents and 3 staff members, every person could be assisted at mealtime. Residents who needed help eating received it. Residents who could feed themselves were encouraged to do so, because independence was now understood as a goal, not an inconvenience. Meals were served at a table, not on trays in a ward. Residents could choose what they wanted to eat. A concept so basic that its absence in the institutional system seems almost incomprehensible, but which had been entirely absent for tens of thousands of people for the better part of a century. The federal legislation that followed drew directly on the evidence from the Pennhurst and Willowbrook cases. The Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act of 1975 established protection and advocacy agencies in every state, legal organizations mandated to investigate conditions in any facility serving people with disabilities. These agencies had the authority to enter facilities, review records, interview staff and residents, and file lawsuits. The right to adequate food was among the most fundamental standards they enforced. The Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act of 1980 gave the federal government the authority to investigate and sue institutions that violated residents' constitutional rights, covering prisons, jails, juvenile facilities, and disability institutions. And the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 established the principle that people with disabilities were citizens with civil rights, not patients, not inmates, not children, regardless of their age. The right to live in the community, the right to work, the right to access public services, and the right to be treated with dignity, which encompasses, at its most basic level, the right to be adequately fed. In 1999, the Supreme Court's decision in Olmstead v. LC affirmed that unjustified institutional confinement constituted discrimination under the ADA. States were required to provide community-based services. The institution was no longer the default, the community was. In 1999, the Supreme Court's decision in Olmstead v. LC affirmed that unjustified institutional confinement of people with disabilities constituted discrimination under the ADA. The ruling required states to provide community-based services to people who could benefit from them, effectively establishing, as a matter of constitutional law, what the Pennhurst and Willowbrook cases had argued for 25 years, that the institution was not the answer, and that the rights of the people inside, including the right to be adequately fed, could not be subordinated to the convenience of a system designed to keep them invisible. Willowbrook closed in 1987. Pennhurst closed the same year. Across the country, state after state began the process of moving residents out of large institutions and into community-based group homes, supported living arrangements, and family settings where the ratio of staff to residents was sufficient to ensure that basic needs were met. The group home that replaced the institution is not perfect. No system is. But it has a kitchen. The residents eat at a table. The meals are planned with individual nutritional needs in mind. The staff are trained. The facility is inspected. And the food budget is not buried inside a per-resident number that has to cover every other expense. It is a line item, visible, auditable, and subject to standards that did not exist when Pennhurst was feeding 3,500 people on less than a zoo spent on its animals. The arithmetic that governed Pennhurst, $5.90 per person per day, was not the product of malice. It was the product of indifference expressed through a budget. The legislators who set the funding level did not intend to underfeed the residents. They intended to spend as little as possible on people who could not vote, could not advocate for themselves, could not be seen by the public, and could not complain in terms that the system was structured to hear. The food was the most tangible evidence of that indifference. You can debate whether a building is adequately maintained. You can argue about staffing ratios. You cannot hide an empty plate. The next time you sit down to a meal, any meal, anywhere, the food in front of you represents a set of choices. Someone chose the ingredients. Someone set the budget. Someone decided what you were worth feeding. For most of the 20th century, the residents of Pennhurst and Willowbrook and the hundreds of institutions like them had those choices made by a system that valued efficiency over adequacy, invisibility over accountability, and cost over the dignity of the people it was supposed to serve. The laws that closed those institutions did not just change where people with disabilities lived, they changed what they were fed, and by whom, and under what standard of care. The meal on the table in a community group home is not just food. It is evidence. Evidence that the system learned, at enormous cost and after unconscionable delay, that every person in a country's care deserves to be fed as a person. That principle does not explain itself. It does not describe Pennhurst or Willowbrook, or the reporter who brought a camera inside, or the attorney who filed the lawsuit, or the judge who ruled that the Constitution applied to people the system had tried to forget. It does not mention the $5.90, or the zoo that spent more. It simply means that the most vulnerable people in the country are being fed, because someone proved what happened when they weren't.